They would remember, the guests who sat at the long table at Ashcombe Court that night, that the Duke of Ashcombe smiled when he said it, and that the smiling was the cruelest part. There were 16 at dinner, the first families of the county among them, and the candles doubled themselves in the polished mahogany and in the ranked glasses, and the talk had been running easy and bright, and the Duchess of Ashcombe had just begun to answer a question that old Sir Henry Combe had put to her across the table, a question about the new drainage bill, which she understood better than any person in the room, having in plain fact written the greater part of it, when her husband set down his glass and turned to her with that mild, amused courtesy that everyone who knew him had learned to dread, and said, so that all 16 heard it, "You will speak only if Miss Aubrey allows it. She is our guest, and I find I prefer her conversation to yours. You may sit quietly and learn from her how a woman ought to be heard." Miss Aubrey, Clara Aubrey, who sat at the Duke's right hand where the ranking guest should sit, and where a wife might have expected to see no one seated above her own consequence. A handsome, laughing, voluble young woman with a great deal of charm and, as the Duchess had already privately and accurately measured, not one idea in her head that had not been put there by the last person to flatter her. A woman who talked easily and endlessly and said nothing, and who now, hearing herself named the arbiter of another woman's right to speak, gave a little pleased laugh as though it were a compliment, and did not decline the office. And Eleanor, Duchess of Ashcombe, who had a moment before been speaking sense about a matter of real consequence to 10,000 acres and the families on them, closed her mouth and folded her hands in her lap and did not finish her sentence and did not begin another. She said nothing at all for the rest of that dinner, not one word. Sir Henry, embarrassed, tried twice more to draw her, gallantly pretending nothing had happened, and both times she only inclined her head a little and turned her eyes to Miss Aubrey, as though waiting, with perfect and terrible courtesy, for permission that she knew would not meaningfully come. And Miss Aubrey, discomforted at last by a silence she did not understand and could not fill, chattered the faster to cover it, and the Duke, who had expected perhaps a flush, a tremor, the small satisfying evidence that his shot had struck, found instead that his wife had taken his command and obeyed it so completely, so literally, so utterly without protest, that the obedience itself had become the loudest thing in the room. For there is a kind of silence that is submission, and there is a kind of silence that is judgment, and every soul at that table slowly understood that they were sitting inside the second kind, and that the Duchess of Ashcombe, by the simple act of saying nothing, had made it impossible for anyone to speak of anything else. If you have ever been talked over as though your voice were an inconvenience, if you have ever been spoken for by someone who did not trouble to learn what you thought or told, in words or in everything but words, that your opinion was wanted only when it was convenient and your silence was the greater gift, then you know the particular cold that Eleanor felt settle over her at that table. And you know, too, that the cruelest silencing is not the one that makes you want to weep, but the one that makes you go very still and very clear, and begin, behind your quiet face, to reckon. Tell me where you are listening from, and whether you have known such a table. I think many of us have sat at one. But stay with her, because a silenced woman is not the same as a defeated one, and Eleanor Ashcombe had only just begun to be heard. When the ladies withdrew, she went with them, and sat among them in the drawing-room, and still did not speak, and the other women, who had witnessed the thing, and did not know how to meet it, let her be. When the gentleman came through, she rose. She went to her husband, and made him the small exact curtsy that courtesy required. No more, and no less. And she looked at him for a moment, with an expression he would spend a great many nights afterward trying and failing to read. It was not anger, and it was not hurt. It was something worse than either. It was a kind of final attention, the look of a person taking the last careful measurement of a thing before setting it down forever. And then she turned and walked the length of the great drawing-room in the hush that had fallen, and let herself out of the double doors, and did not ring for a servant to attend her, and did not send for her husband, and did not come back. She saw herself out. And upstairs, without haste, she began to pack. She did it by the light of one candle, alone, having sent her maid to bed so that no one should have to choose between loyalty and discretion, and as she folded the plain things and left the fine ones, the court gowns, the jewels, the fur, she looked at the thing that had been done to her with the same clear attention she gave to a knotted account, and understood it wholly before she was finished. She saw that the command at the table had not been the careless cruelty of a man in wine. She had watched him choose the words and smile them, and she knew him too well to mistake it. It was a message, and she read it. Your voice, which is the best of you, is the very thing I cannot bear, and so I will make you understand that you hold it only at my sufferance, and may use it only when it does not outshine me or trouble my comfort, and you will be grateful for so much. And she saw that she could accept the message and stay, that most women in her place did, that the world was full of clever wives who had learned to be quiet and let a lesser man be thought the wiser, and that no one would think the worse of her for it. But she found, searching herself honestly in the candlelight, that she could not. Not from pride alone, though there was pride in it, but because her voice was not a mere accomplishment she could set aside like a fan. It was her father's one gift to her, the whole inheritance of a poor, good-learned man who had taught his daughter to think and to say what she thought as though it were the most precious thing he owned. Because it was. And to be told that this, of all things, must be locked away to spare a husband's vanity, was to be told that the truest part of her, the part that was most her father's and most her own, had no place in that house. She would not lock it away. She would take it where it could be spoken. And once that was decided, she found she was not weeping and not shaking, but wholly calm, calmer than she had been in the long, careful year of biting back the half of what she saw, and she blew out the candle and slept, and rose before the house, and went. To understand what he lost when she stopped speaking, you must understand that her voice had been, quite literally and quite invisibly, the government of his whole world. Eleanor had come to him, the daughter of a scholar clergyman, a learned, gentle, poor man who had given his only child the education he would have given a son, Latin and a little Greek, logic and history, and the long patient art of argument, and who had died leaving her nothing but that education and a name without money to back it. The marriage had been arranged, the Ashcombe estate was large and troubled, and the Duke had wanted a wife who would not embarrass him and would not cost him anything of himself, and Eleanor had been recommended as sensible and quiet and grateful. And she had been all three, and she had also been, though no one thought to mention it because no one thought it mattered in a wife, the finest natural advocate the county had seen in a generation. She wrote his letters. That was how it began. A duke has a vast correspondence, and this one found it tedious, and his new wife offered to draft the tiresome ones, and did it so well that within a year she drafted them all, the delicate ones and the hard ones, and the ones that turned enemies into allies and creditors into patient friends, and it spread from the letters to the leases, which she made just and clear where they had been ruinous and vague, and from the leases to the whole business of the estate's dealings with the world, until the plain unspoken truth of it was that when the Duke of Ashcombe spoke to the county, it was very often Eleanor's words in his mouth, and the county's high opinion of his judgment was in fact its opinion of hers. It had begun in the second month of the marriage with a single letter. There was a creditor of the late Duke's, a hard, suspicious man who held a note that could have embarrassed the estate, and the young Duke had drafted a reply that was stiff with wounded pride and would have turned a difficulty into an enemy, and had left it on his desk, and Eleanor, new to the house and uncertain of her ground, had read it by accident and seen the disaster in it, and had ventured, very carefully, to suggest a different word here and there, and then, when he waved an irritated permission, had quietly rewritten the whole, turning the affront into an appeal to the man's own interest and his vanity together, so that the creditor not only forbore, but became, within the year, a friend to the estate. The Duke had been astonished. He had not known that words could do that, could reach into another man and turn him, and he had begun, first with relief and then with a growing unthinking dependence, to give her the letters, all of them, and she had written them, and the county had begun to remark how the young Duke of Ashcombe had a way with a difficult correspondent, a gift for the right word, an unexpected wisdom in his dealings. And it was all Eleanor, every syllable of it, and no one knew. And for a long while she did not mind that no one knew, because it was enough to be doing the work and doing it well and feeling the estate steady under her hand. She asked no credit. She signed nothing. She built his reputation letter by letter and lease by lease, and handed it to him whole. And he wore it, and came in time to believe it fitted him because it was his own. And this is the quiet danger of doing great work in another's name, that the other forgets it was ever lent, and comes at last to resent the true owner as a kind of creditor, a reminder of a debt he would rather not remember he owes. The drainage bill was the height of it. There was a great scheme afoot to drain the Ashcombe levels, a matter of parliamentary consequence and bitter local dispute, with a dozen interests set against it, and a committee to be persuaded, and a case to be made in language exact enough to survive lawyers, and it was Eleanor who had mastered the whole of it. The engineering and the law and the politics alike, and Eleanor who had written the case, and Eleanor who had, through 100 careful letters over the name of the Duke, and 100 quiet suggestions as to what he should say and to whom, brought the thing to the very edge of success. So that the Duke of Ashcombe was spoken of, that season, as a coming man, a nobleman of unexpected grasp and eloquence, and he had begun to believe it of himself, which was perhaps the root of what happened at the dinner. For a man who has been praised for a wisdom that is secretly his wife's must either honour her for it or come, by degrees, to resent her for it, and resentment is the easier road for a certain kind of pride. His pride had its history, as all such prides do. Marcus, Duke of Ashcombe, had been raised by a mother who governed by the tum, a brilliant, cold, verbal woman who had made her son feel, all through his boyhood, that he was slow, that his thoughts came out clumsy and late, that in the quick cut and parry of clever talk he would always be the one left flat-footed and flushed. And she had done it, as such mothers do, in front of people, so that the shame of being out-talked was welded in him to the shame of being seen. And once, at 23, newly come to his title, he had risen to speak at a great county meeting, and lost his thread and stammered, and sat down to a silence that he heard, rightly or wrongly, as contempt. And a rival had risen smoothly after him and carried the room, and the Duke had never forgotten it, and had resolved in the way wounded proud men resolve things, that he would never again be the one who was outspoken in public. And here, years later, was a wife whose every sentence was better than his, who could do without effort the one thing he most feared to fail at, and whom he loved, which made it unbearable. For it is one thing to be surpassed by a stranger, and another to be surpassed daily and intimately and gratefully by the person whose good opinion you have come, against all your intentions, to need. For he had come to need it, and that was the buried spring of the whole disaster. In the 4th year of their marriage, the Duke of Ashcombe had begun, without ever deciding to be happy. He had taken to bringing his wife the day's problems not to be solved, though she solved them, but for the pleasure of watching her mind move. He had begun to say we shall carry the bill, we shall win the committee. He had caught himself, in company, watching her face when he spoke, to see whether he had said the thing well, and steering by it. And this happiness had frightened him exactly as it frightens a man who has built his whole self on needing no one. And when Clara Aubrey had come into the county that spring, pretty and empty and adoring, asking nothing of him but that he be great and clever in her admiring eyes, requiring no we, threatening him with no surpassing. He had turned to her the way a man turns to a warm shallow bath after the labour of the deep cold sea, and had told himself it was preference when it was flight. And at that dinner, with the county watching and his wife in the very act of being brilliant about his bill, the old welded shame had risen in him. She is being heard, and I am not. And they will know whose wisdom it was, and he had reached for the one weapon that would silence the thing he could not bear to hear, which was her voice, and he had used it, and smiled while he did. She had hoped. That was the part that would take him longest to forgive himself, when at last he understood it. She was not a woman who hoped easily. Her upbringing, gentle but pinched, had taught her to expect little and to be grateful for less. But there had been, in that 4th year, small, unmistakable signs that the arrangement was becoming a marriage. He had asked her opinion once in front of his steward, and then done as she advised and let the steward see him do it. He had said, one evening by the fire, reading over a letter she had drafted, "You give me a better self than I am, you know." And she had not known what to say and had said nothing, but had kept the sentence and turned it over many times in the dark. She had begun, cautiously, to believe that she was becoming necessary, not merely useful, valued, not merely employed, and that her voice, which was the truest thing she had, the one gift her poor learned father had left her, was at last being heard and loved by the one person whose hearing she had come to want. And then, at the long table, before the county. That same voice had been named an inconvenience, and set below the chatter of a woman who had never in her life said anything worth writing down. And Eleanor had understood in the space of a single smiling sentence that the hope had been a fond mistake, or that if it had been true he would rather kill it in public than be seen to hold it, and that either way there was nothing left in that house for the truest part of her to live on. So she took the truest part of her away. She went to her father's people first, an old aunt in Wells, and then, within the month, she did the thing that no one expected of a disgraced duchess, which was to make her voice pay. For it happened that a society existed in the cathedral town for the relief of the poor and the reform of the workhouse, a worthy body long hampered by the fact that its cause was just and its advocates were dull. And Eleanor, going quietly to its meetings at her aunt's suggestion, had risen one evening to speak to a point, and had spoken for the first time in her life in her own person, under her own name, with no husband's title to carry her words, and the room had gone still in the way rooms go still when they know they are hearing the real thing, and by the end of the month she was the society's voice, drafting its petitions and arguing its case before magistrates, and once, memorably, before a parliamentary commissioner who had come expecting to be bored and went away having promised his help. She was not paid in coin for this, but she was paid in the thing she had been starved of, which was to be heard for herself, and it fed her, and she grew, in those weeks, into a fuller and freer version of the woman who had sat silent at the Ashcombe table. There was one evening in particular that the town spoke of long after. A parliamentary commissioner had come down to inquire into the workhouse, a busy, important man who plainly regarded the whole errand as a tedious formality, and the local reformers as well, meaning fools. And he had sat through an hour of dull-worthy speeches with the glaze of the professional listener, and then a plain grey woman had risen at the back and begun to speak, quietly, without notes. And within 3 minutes he had put down his pen and was leaning forward, and within 10 he was asking her questions, real ones. The questions of a man who has met a mind at least the equal of his own and is glad of it, and she had answered every one, with fact and figure and a moral force that was the stronger for being perfectly controlled, and had ended by laying before him, in terms he could not evade, exactly what the law required of him, and exactly what his own reputation required of him, which she had taken care to make the same thing, and he had gone away having promised what an hour before he had come determined to refuse. Afterward he had asked who she was, and been told she was a lady lately come to the town, a clergyman's daughter, and he had said that she was wasted in a cathedral close, and would have made a great man's fortune in the house, and had been faintly surprised at the odd silence that met the remark from those who knew whose wife she was, and did not say. And Eleanor, walking home under the cathedral's dark bulk that night, had felt something she had not felt in years, which was the plain, clean joy of using her whole gift in the open air, in her own name, for a good end, with no one to smile it into silence. And she had understood fully that the thing done to her at the long table had been meant to make her small, and had instead driven her out into the one air in which she could at last be her whole size. The house she left behind fell mute in every way that mattered. The letters were the first to fail. The Duke, sitting down to a correspondence he had not truly written in years, produced replies that were stiff where hers had been supple, blunt where hers had been deft, and within a fortnight a delicate negotiation with a neighbouring landowner over a contested watercourse. A thing Eleanor would have settled with 3 warm paragraphs had curdled into a lawsuit. The neighbour was a proud, touchy old squire named Fenwick, with whom the Ashcombe estate shared a stream and a long history of small grievances, and Eleanor had for 4 years kept the peace with him by a steady traffic of courtesies and careful letters, never conceding what mattered, but always leaving him his dignity, so that the 2 estates had prospered side by side. The Duke, taking up the correspondence himself, had answered Fenwick's latest complaint about the weir with a letter that was legally unanswerable and humanly insufferable. Correct in every particular and warm in none. A letter that told a proud old man he was wrong and did not trouble to let him save his face, and Fenwick, who could have been managed with a sentence of respect, went to law instead. And the 2 estates that had shared a stream in peace for a generation were suddenly sharing it through attorneys, at a cost in money and ill will, out of all proportion to the thing in dispute. The Duke could not understand it. He had been right, entirely right, and being right had cost him a neighbour and a great sum, and the quiet of the whole west side of his land. He did not yet grasp that his wife's genius had never been in being right. Anyone clever could be right, but in the far rarer art of being right, without making another man feel small for being wrong. And that this art, which he had dismissed as mere female softness, was the very mortar that had held his world together, and that he had knocked it out with his own correct and chilly hand. Then the leases, a new one, drawn without her, was found to have given away a right she would have kept, and a mill with it. And then, worst and most public, the bill. The drainage bill came on in committee, and the Duke of Ashcombe rose to speak for it. The bill that had made his reputation, the bill the county believed to be the flower of his statesmanship, and found that he did not in truth understand it, that the mastery had never been his, that the answers to the committee's sharp questions had always come from a letter-book in a small clear hand, and the letter-book was in Wells, and its author was not answering his letters. He stumbled. He was out-argued by the very interests Eleanor's papers had been built to defeat. And the bill that had been at the edge of triumph was lost, put off, sent back, years of her invisible work undone in an afternoon, because the voice that had done it was gone. And the Duke sat down in that committee room to a silence that he heard, once again and this time justly as contempt, and understood, sitting there, exactly what he had thrown away, and whose it had been. And that he had not merely silenced his wife, but disinherited himself of the better mind he had been borrowing and calling his own. He went home and read her letter-books through a whole night, the way another man might read the letters of the dead, the drafts and the fair copies and the marginal notes to herself. If I press him here he yields. Do not corner Coombe, he must be let to save his face. The argument holds only if we grant the millers their weir. Be generous there, and win the rest. And he saw laid bare before him the whole vast architecture of tact and intellect and patient human understanding that he had passed off for years as his own natural genius. And he was ashamed to the root of his soul, and he saw too in 100 small kindnesses buried in the business letters, a widow's petition quietly forwarded, a young curate's preferment quietly urged, the same buried generosity that had run under everything she did, and he understood that he had married a great soul and used her like a clerk and silenced her like a servant, and that the county's high opinion of him had been all along an unpaid debt to her. He sat with the letter-books open before him until the candle drowned in its own wax and the grey light came up cold at the windows. And he did the thing he had spent his whole life avoiding, which was to look steadily at himself without the flattering veil of another's borrowed words. He saw the boy at his mother's table, scarlet and mute, while she made a wit of his slowness for the amusement of her friends. He saw the young man rising to speak at the county meeting and losing the thread and sitting down into that laughter he had never stopped hearing. He saw how he had built, on those two wounds, a whole cold fortress of a self whose first law was never to be outspoken, never to be seen to be the lesser mind, and how the god of that fortress had demanded, in the end, the sacrifice of the one person who had ever given him more than she took, because her very gift was the thing the fortress was built to fear. He saw that his mother had made him cruel by making him ashamed, and that he had passed the cruelty on to the one who least deserved it, and that this was not an excuse but the plain mechanism of the thing, the way a struck man strikes the next. And he resolved, sitting there in the cold dawn with her handwriting under his hands, not to win her back, he had not yet the right to think in those terms, but to become, whether she ever returned or not, a man who deserved to have deserved her. And he understood that this would be the work of years, and that there was no short-cut through it, and no speech that could stand in its place, and for once in his life the knowledge did not frighten him, because it was, at last, true. His aunt came, because in these houses there is always an aunt, and she was his mother's sister, and had loved his mother not at all, and saw her son's inherited cruelty with a clear, cold eye. Lady Sarah Ashcombe was 80 and deaf in one ear, and afraid of no living thing, and she came uninvited and stayed uninvited, and said to her nephew the thing that needed saying. "Your mother silenced you," she said, "at every dinner of your boyhood, until you grew up believing that to be talked over is the worst thing that can happen to a man, and that the way to be safe is to be the one who does the silencing. And the first time God gave you a woman worth listening to, you did to her the very thing that was done to you, and called it your right. You are not a stupid man, Marcus, whatever your mother taught you to fear. But you have been a coward, which is worse than stupid, because a coward chooses. Eleanor Ashcombe has the best head and the truest tongue in this county, and you told her to be quiet so that a pretty fool could talk, and now the fool has gone quiet too because there is nothing in her to say, and your fine bill is lost, and your house is full of the wrong silence. There is a right silence and a wrong one. You had the right one, a wife who was quiet because she chose her words and spoke gold when she spoke. You have exchanged it for the wrong one. Go and get her back, if she will have you, which I doubt, and if you do, spend the rest of your life listening, which you have never once done." And she rapped her stick upon the floor and rose, but at the door she paused and said one thing more quietly, for she had loved her sister not at all, but she loved this flawed nephew despite himself. "I watched your mother do it to you," she said, "year upon year, and I said nothing, because it was not my place, and because I was a coward too in my way, and I have wondered since whether a single word from me might have spared you becoming what she made you. So I will not make that mistake twice. Go and get her, Marcus, and when you have her, if God and her good sense allow it, which is more than you deserve, you listen to that woman until the day you die, and you let the whole county hear you listen. For the only cure for a life of being silenced and silencing is to become, out loud and where it costs you, a man who would rather hear the truth from his wife than a compliment from a fool. And then she went up and left him with it, and he sat a long time after her candle had gone. And there was a child, for there is always a child. Eleanor had a goddaughter in the house that season, a small grave girl named Sophie, the orphan daughter of a friend, whom Eleanor had been teaching to read and, more than to read, to argue, to say what she meant and mean what she said, and not be talked out of a true thing by a loud one. Sophie had adored her, and had not been told why her godmother had gone. And some days after Lady Sarah's arrival, the Duke found the child sitting at the foot of the great stairs, and she looked up at him and asked, with the flat, unanswerable directness of 7 years old, "Why did you tell Aunt Eleanor to be quiet? She has the best things to say. You said the quiet lady was better, but the quiet lady says silly things. Aunt Eleanor says a person who talks a lot isn't the same as a person who has something to say. Did you forget which one she is?" And the Duke, who had silenced a parliamentary committee's worth of clever men in his time with a cold word, found he had nothing whatever to say to a child of 7. Because she had asked him the only real question, and the true answer was, "I was afraid of how much better she was," and you cannot say that to a child, and once you have heard yourself unable to say anything truer, you cannot go on, hiding it from yourself. He told her he had forgotten, and had been very wrong and meant to mend it. Sophie considered this with great seriousness. "You'll have to let her talk first now," she said, "for a long time, to make up." And she returned to her book and left him undone. Clara Aubrey, meanwhile, unmade herself, as such women do, by the very quality that had drawn him, her endless confident speech, which was charming when it cost nothing and disastrous the moment it touched anything real. For she had taken to speaking for the Duke, in company, as she had seen the Duchess's words go out under his name, and had understood only the form of the thing, and not its substance. And at a gathering of some consequence, with men present whose goodwill the estate needed, she had answered for him on a question of the disputed watercourse, airily and wrongly, committing him before witnesses to a position that was both false and offensive, and had then compounded it by laughing when a grave man grew grave. The Duke had watched her do it, and had seen, as if a veil were drawn, the whole difference between the two women he had set one above the other, that Eleanor's voice, which he had silenced, built, and mended and reconciled, and that Clara's voice, which he had exalted, flattered, and blundered, and destroyed, that he had thrown away the one and enthroned the other and called it his preference, and that he was a fool. He ended it quietly and without cruelty, for he had learned at least that much, settled a generous sum, and saw her comfortably away, and asked for nothing back, there being nothing of the estates that she had ever truly held, and the great house was left to its silence, and the silence was the wrong kind, and the right kind was in Wells, and did not answer his letters. He did not write to her again after the 3rd unanswered letter, understanding at last that letters were the coin she had every reason to distrust from him, his letters having so long been hers. Instead he waited, and did the harder thing, which was to begin to change before there was any reward in sight for changing. He took up the drainage bill again himself, and this time he learned it, truly, line by line, sitting up with the engineers and the lawyers until he understood it as she had understood it. not to pass it off as his own, but because it was right, and the levels needed draining, and the families on them deserved better than his ignorance. And it was slow and humbling, and he was not naturally quick at it, and he did it anyway, and the doing of it taught him, better than any lecture, the size of the labour she had carried unthanked for years. And when the bill came on again, months later, in a great public session with the county in the gallery, he did the thing that undid the last of his old self, and began the making of the new. For Eleanor was there. She had come, not for him, but for the levels, whose cause she had never stopped serving. She had been brought by the Reform Society, whose petition on a related head was to be heard the same day, and she sat in the public gallery in her plain grey gown, unremarked, the disgraced duchess turned advocate, come to see whether the great bill she had built might yet be saved. And the duke, rising to speak, saw her in the gallery, and he set down the notes he had made, the notes that were for the first time truly his own, and he said to the chairman, before the whole assembly, in a steady voice, that he would not be the best advocate for this bill in the room, and that the best advocate for it was present, and that with the committee's leave he would yield the floor to the person who had in plain truth authored the measure, and understood it as no one else living did. And he named her. He named his wife, in open session, before the county that had watched him silence her, and he asked her to speak, and gave her his own place, and sat down. It cost him everything his pride had ever been built on. It was, before all those people, a public confession that the wisdom they had credited to him was hers, and he paid it, deliberately, in full, and did not flinch, and would have paid more. And Eleanor rose in the gallery, and came down and took the floor her husband had given her, and spoke, in her own person, under her own name, with all the mastery of years poured into a single grave lucid hour, and carried the committee, and saved the bill, and the levels were drained, and 10,000 acres and the families on them were the better for it for 100 years, and it was done by a woman her husband had told, at a dinner, to speak only if another woman allowed it. The gallery had come to a stillness while she spoke that was the exact opposite of the stillness at the long table. That had been the silence of a room watching a woman be made small, and this was the silence of a room discovering it was in the presence of something large. And when she finished, there was a sound that is rare in committee rooms, a low, involuntary murmur of respect. And men who had spent the season crediting the Duke of Ashcombe with a wisdom beyond his years, understood in a single hour whose wisdom it had always been, and did not think the worse of him for it, but rather the better. For there is nothing that becomes a proud man so well as the moment he stops being proud in a good cause. He sat below her while she spoke, in the humbler place, and watched the county learn what he had learned, and felt, instead of the shame he had braced for, a thing he had no name for at first, and knew afterward for pride of the only worthy kind, not pride in himself, which had ruined him, but pride in her, which he understood at last to be the difference between the small soul and the great, that the one can only be proud of what is its own, and the other can rejoice to be surpassed by what it loves. He went to Wells afterward, in the spring, and did not send ahead, and waited in the cold parlour of her aunt's house, with his hat in his hands until she came to him, and he made her no speech, having learned the price of speeches from her, and the price of silence from himself. He told her the truth plainly. He said that he had married her to save himself trouble, and had been saved instead, at every turn, by her mind and her voice, and had never once said thank you. He said that he had silenced her at the table not because her voice was too little, but because it was too great, and he too small and too afraid, and that the fear was his mother's legacy and the cruelty his own choice, and that he made no excuse of the one for the other. He said that he had learned the bill at last himself, not to take it from her, but to be worthy of standing in a room where she spoke. He said that he did not ask her to come back to be his useful voice, for she had proved she could be her own and needed no husband to carry her words. And he said that he was sorry, not as a word, but as the whole remaining work of his life, and that if she would not have him, he would settle on her the means to go on being heard wherever she chose, and trouble her no more, and count himself justly answered by her silence. She heard him out. She who had been forbidden to speak now let him speak to the end, which was its own quiet lesson, and while he spoke she was weighing him, not his words, for she had learned to distrust words from him precisely because the best of them had so often been her own. She was watching the man beneath the words, the set of his shoulders that had always been so proudly squared and was not squared now, the hands that had always been so still and were not still, the eyes that had never in 4 years met hers for longer than composure required, and did not leave hers now. She had heard many apologies in her life, from tenants and creditors, and once from her own father, and she knew the difference between the apology that is a door and the apology that is a wall dressed as a door, the one that opens onto real change, and the one that is offered precisely so that nothing need change, so that the wronged party may be quieted with the form of contrition and the wrongdoer spared its substance. She had come to the parlour half certain his would be the second kind, the eloquent self-forgiving sort, and had armoured herself against it. And she found, listening, that it was not, that he made no eloquence at all, offered no soft turn of phrase, reached for none of the borrowed grace she had spent years lending him, that he told the ugly truth of his own fear plainly, and let it stand ugly, and named his cruelty cruelty, and his cowardice cowardice, and put no cushion under either. And that a man who has spent his life terrified of speaking badly, and who consents, in the one conversation that matters most, to speak plainly and badly and true rather than well and falsely, has told you something no polished apology ever could. It moved her more than she let him see. But she had been moved once before, by the small hopeful signs of that 4th year, and had been punished for it before the whole county, and she was not a woman to be twice governed by feeling against her judgment, and so she let the movement pass through her and settle, and kept her own counsel a moment longer. And then she answered him, and her answer was as exact and as ordered as one of her own arguments. She said she believed him, because he had yielded her the floor before the county at a cost she knew to the penny, and a man does not pay that price for a lie. But she said that belief was not trust, and that trust was a thing rebuilt in months and not in an hour, and that she had been silenced once for the crime of speaking well, and would not stake her voice again on a fine apology. If he wished her to consider a return, it would be on terms, and she named them like the clauses of a bill, that her voice in that house and in that county would be her own, and acknowledged as her own, never again spoken over, never again passed off, never again set below anyone's for any man's comfort or any host's convenience, that when there was a thing to be said, she would say it, in her own person, and he would sooner learn to be the second best speaker at his own table than ever again make her the silent one. and that he would prove all this not by promising it, but by doing it, over time, before witnesses, in the small daily ways that were harder than any grand session, and that she reserved always the right to go again, and that he would not find her voice so easy to fetch home a second time. And she said, last, that she would keep her own name a while yet, and speak under it, until he had shown her that the name of Ashcombe would never again be used to swallow hers. He agreed to every term, and argued not one, there being no clause in it that was not just, and the winning back of her was, exactly as she had promised, slow and public and undramatic, and it remade him. He brought her the county's business by post, and did as she counselled, and let it be known that he did. He rose more than once in meeting and company, and said the words that cost him most, and grew, with practice, to cost him less. My wife will tell you she has the right of it. Ask the Duchess, she knows this better than I. He listened, which he had never done, at his own table, first and longest to her. And he went, before he went to Wells at all, and did the thing that showed her, when word of it reached her as such word does, that the change was more than sentiment. He went to old Fenwick, the neighbour he had driven to law, and he called off his attorneys, and he sat in the squire's parlour, and said plainly that he had been in the right about the weir, and wholly in the wrong about the man, that he had treated an old neighbour with a coldness he was ashamed of, and that he had come to ask pardon, and to settle the stream between them as neighbours and not as litigants, and Fenwick, who had wanted nothing all along but to be treated with respect, was so disarmed that the two estates were at peace again within the week, on terms scarcely different from those the Duke's chilly letter had first proposed, the only difference being the respect, which was the whole of the difference, and which the Duke had learned, too late to spare himself the lawsuit, but not too late to matter, from the absence of the woman who had always supplied it. He did a dozen such things in those months, quietly, without display, mending with his own hand the small human fabric he had torn by mistaking correctness for wisdom, and each of them taught him again the size of what she had done unthanked for years, and each of them, he hoped, though he did not do them for the hope, might reach her ear as evidence that a man may, if he sets himself to it late and humbly enough, learn even the things he was raised to fear. And when at the turn of the year she consented to come back to Ashcombe, to see, she said, not to stay. He had made no grand preparation except one. He had had her letter-books and her desk brought down to the finest room in the house, the great south room where the best light fell, that had always been called the Duke's study, and he had had a new plate cut for its door, and the plate said, not the Duke's study, but the Duchess's, and he showed it to her without a word and watched her read it, and saw something ease in her that no apology had reached. It was the child who spoke the last of it, as the clear-eyed child in such tales always does. Smallgrave's Sophie, restored to her godmother and glued to her side, said to the Duke across the dinner-table one evening, a dinner much like the ruinous one, the same room, the same long mahogany, the same county faces, only the whole meaning of it turned inside out. You let her talk first now. For a long time. Like I said, you'd have to. And the table, which knew the story, went very still, and the Duke did not flush and did not smile his old cold smile, but looked at his wife down the length of the table and said, simply, so that all of them heard it, I did. I do. She says everything better than I ever could, and I was a fool to fear it, and the great good fortune of my life is that she consents to say it here." And Eleanor, who had once been told at that same table to speak only if another woman allowed her, looked back at him, and after a moment she smiled, and then she spoke, freely, at length, brilliantly, about the drainage and the workhouse and whatever else she pleased, and no one in that room ever again mistook the quiet woman for the small one. They would say afterward, the household and the county, and in the fullness of time their own children, that the Duke of Ashcombe became, in his later years, famous for a thing rare among great men, which was that he listened, that at his table the youngest and the shyest were drawn out, and the loud were gently checked, and that the first question at any gathering was always put to the Duchess, and her answer waited for and taken, and that the plate on the south room door still said the Duchess's study a lifetime later, and that a lamp was kept lit in its window every evening until she came up, so that she might work at her papers as late as her cause required, and never labour in the dark. There grew up, too, a small ritual that the household marked and cherished and never spoke of in his hearing, that whenever a guest at the Ashcombe table turned a question to the Duke on any matter of weight, he had a way of pausing, and turning to his wife and saying, "My wife will tell you. She has the right of it, and says it better than I do," and then of falling silent and listening with the rest, and the older servants, who remembered the other dinner, the smiling command and the terrible obedient silence, and the grey figure letting herself out of the double doors, would catch one another's eye across the room and say nothing, because there was nothing to say that the thing itself did not say better, that the very sentence which had once been used to strip her of her voice, "You will speak only if she allows it," had been turned clean inside out and made the law of that house forever after, so that now it was the Duke who spoke only when his Duchess had had her say, and counted it the best hour of any evening. And Eleanor herself told their daughters the whole of the story when they were old enough to hear it. The long table, the smiling command, the silence she had chosen and the door she had let herself out of, the town of Wells and the society and the bill saved from the gallery, not to shame their father, who sat by while she told it and bowed his head to the truth of it, but so that they should carry two things all their lives and never let them go, that a woman's voice is not a lesser thing to be permitted or withheld at a man's pleasure, but her own, and the truest of her possessions, which no one can take from her by telling her to be quiet, for she may always take it out of the house that will not hear it, and into the world that will. And that the strongest answer to being silenced is not to shout, but to withdraw the gift of your voice from those who scorn it. Keep your dignity whole, and go and be heard where you are honoured, for it is only from that ground, and never from the ground of pleading, that a marriage or anything else that has been broken by contempt can ever be rebuilt on respect. And the part the daughters loved best was that their mother had been told before the whole county to speak only if another woman allowed it, and had answered with a silence that lost a man his bill and his peace and very nearly his wife, and that she had come back, in her own time and on her own terms, to a house where her word was law and her voice the first and most honoured sound at every table, and that this, and not the title, and not the great south room, and not even the bill she saved, was what it had come to mean, in the end, to be the Duchess of Ashcombe,